Hi, this is Bob Law, and welcome to Bob Law Now, my podcast. It is a conversation we're going to have this morning with Bobby J, premier radio personality, performer. We've got a lot of information we want to share in the few minutes that we do have, and allow us to talk about doo-wop in particular, about the music, the glory days of radio. And I'm so pleased to have one of the members of the Dream Team, one of the most premier and important radio personalities in the country and in the industry. Bobby J, good to be with you. Glad to have you with me. Let me just say again for people to know that Bobby J, one of the premier radio personalities from particular what we might call the golden age of music radio. As a radio personality, he is a performer, he is a singer, but I want to begin, Bobby J, with talking about doo-wop and the
Mm.
origins of doo-wop and what made doo-wop so magical. Your feelings about that?
Well, first of all, from the top, and if Phil Anthony Gordine were here, he would concur with me because most of us who came along in that generation agree the term doo-wop did not exist. We were vocal group harmony singers. The
Mm,
term doo-wop came along in the 60s, and primarily from a disc jockey, Gus Gossard, who worked at CBS FM and he worked at other places. And when he would play the music of the 50s, the vocal group stuff, because a lot of the background vocals said doo-wop, doo-wop, shabop, doo-wop, wop. And so he started calling it doo-wop. I mean, now it's generic, you can't get away from it. But I just wanted to clarify that at the time we were singing, we didn't know what doo-wop was.
mhm,
We were just singing. So,
mm,
because they call the Orioles, Sonny Till and the Orioles, a doo-wop group. They never sang doo-wop in their entire career,
mhm.
per se. But they're not considered doo-wop also. But the vocal group thing began, yeah, with Sonny Till and the Orioles, and it's like the Cardinals, Clovers, and Dominoes, Billy Ward's Dominoes, all in the late 40s, going into the 50s, and it started to get better, started to proliferate. But what expanded it was when Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers showed up in 1956 with "Why the Fools Fall in Love." It exploded.
Mm,
Because here was a young group of kids, teenagers, pun intended, who were making music for teenagers.
mhm.
Again, pun intended. And then it took off all over the world. And now, as I said, it's not generic. We accept. I use the term from time to time, but it just didn't exist at that time.
Talk a bit about what you think is responsible for the very spirit of the music, the magic in the music. The music, we have said in other conversations that this is music that a beginning, a middle, and an end. Uh, any one of these songs and this whole era could be turned into a street corner symphony, opera like Porgy and Bess. What,
Hmm.
what do you think? How can we talk about the magic in the music?
Well, you must remember that it was at a different time when the world was a lot different. And love songs permeated the radio and the record industry. It was all about love songs. And you're right, songs had a beginning, a middle, and an end. They told a story.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were good, they could sometimes become sequels. Case in point, James Shepard, The Heartbeats. He wrote a song about he had a girlfriend who moved to Texas and she was 1,000 miles away. And of course, he wrote a song about it, and the Heartbeats had a hit with it, and it just led into so many other things. When she was halfway home, he wrote another song called "500 Miles to Go." So every one thing always led into another, and then when you had 4 or 5 people, be they male or female, who could harmonize, you couldn't beat it.
There are other songs like that. And then there was an effort to um, capture that same sentiment. What was it like, though, in that whole era for you, teenagers and other performers? How old were y'all? Frankie Lyman with the teenagers. Everybody was a teenager around that time.
Yeah.
What kind of lifestyle was that? I know people talk about how the record industry also was not trying to create careers for kids. They would just get out and just keep moving on. But the kids loved just being on, hearing it on the radio. The people, other kids in the neighborhood knew who you were. Just what was that like? Just being in that era.
Well, first of all, there was no record industry at that time. It subsequently became a record industry, and now in the 21st century, it really doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
But they felt this music was going to be very short lived, it wasn't going to be around long, and that at some point, everyone is going to regain and recapture their sanity, and the music of the crooners, the Tony Bennett's, the Frank Sinatras, would return. But when the kids started getting into it, it was done. It was over. Thinking of the teenagers, the first group to travel the world in this music, first group to play London Palladium. And after they did the London Palladium, they had a private performance for Princess Margaret and Queen Elizabeth. They went to contiguous 48 states of America, didn't have Alaska and Hawaii then. They went to every state. And I often say, because, as you know, I was in the latter version of the teenagers. We were called Frankie Lyman's legendary teenagers.
Mhm.
And again, in the 90s and into the 2000s, we again traveled the world to go to places like Barcelona, Spain, to go to a seaside town called Senigallia, Italy. And I'm talking about kids now, I'm talking about young people
Mhm.
who weren't around when the records were originally released, but they knew all the songs and they would sing the songs. They could barely speak English,
Mm.
but they knew all the lyrics of the song. It was a mind blowing thing to experience, and I loved it.
Yeah. I went to, or Frankie Lyman and the teenagers went to, what's the TV show? Ed Sullivan. You remember says that, and that was a major appearance.
Frankie, Frank, Frankie appeared. The teenagers never appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, but Frankie did
Oh, okay.
in December of 1957. A record out called "It's Christmas Once Again," and he went on the show and he sang "Goody Goody," which was his solo hit, and then he sang "It's Christmas Once Again." And a
Mhm.
funny thing, if you've ever seen the clip of it, Ed Sullivan, being Ed Sullivan, kept calling Frankie Lyman Frankie Robinson. and and when Frankie finished singing and called him over, he said that his producers, director, kept saying, "I kept calling you Frankie Robinson." He said, "Do you know why?" And Frankie, because Frankie was, I mean, there was only one Frankie Lyman. As Jimmy Castor said, he was a brat and everything else, but he knew how to play the game. And he said, "No, sir, I don't know why." He said, I was thinking of Sugar Ray Robinson, who
Right.
was a champion in his own right,
Mhm.
but that was
Mm. Mm.
that was
Mm.
that was absolutely amazing. But now he also appeared on Alan Freed's show on Channel 5, and it was the old Dumont television network at that time. And Alan had a very short-lived show because Frankie was on the show. Whatever record was playing, they caught Frankie dancing with a white girl.
Yeah.
Now we're talking 1957. Alan's show, was immediately canceled.
Wow.
It was a good show. It was a great show. But when I was with the Laddins, we appeared on his show. We appeared on his show 3 times in 1 week in
Mm.
1950. That's how it was because the powers that be felt that because most of the groups at that time were black, yeah, not a white group, but it was predominantly black, and that their white daughters
Mm-hmm.
were enraptured by these black singers,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't going to have that.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't going to have that at all. We got to get rid of this music.
Mm-hmm.
But that was in the 1950s. Here it is, 2025. Music is still around.
Yeah.
you know, they never killed it.
Yeah. The let me just kind of segue. I learned that term from you when I came to
Yes,
the radio.
out of one thing and right back into another.
That's right. That's Bobby Jay's line.
That's right.
And in fact, that's what we want to do right now. Let's talk about music radio. And
Yes.
there was a time when there was more than one era. There was one era of music where the personalities only had one show. You had Jocko and then Jackson. There might have been,
Hmm.
I don't know, there were shows like that. And then there was another era where it was black music or 24-hour black, and that is one of the eras of glory days of black
Hmm.
radio. Let's talk a little bit about that. Those early days, though, Jacko, guys like that. Uh, what was state of black radio at that point? How would we describe that? And then let's talk about black music radio when who were like you and Dream Team were came known as the Dream Team. Let's talk about that.
Well, black radio as such really didn't get popular. I worked at a station in Memphis, WDIA, which is a 50,000 watt station,
Hmm.
which became one of the first stations, if not the first station, to play black music 24 hours. And I think WAOK in Atlanta was another.
Hmm.
Most stations, including our former alma mater, WWRL, these stations played black music only portions of the day. Other portions of the day, they had other type of programming going on. And black radio as such, I'll have to give credit to Soundlink Broadcasting Corporation. When they bought the station in 1965, I think it was, it became totally black. And because WLIB was a daytimer, they only worked from sun up to sundown, which was one of our derisive statements we made about WLIB. We would say WWRL, the station that doesn't run down at sundown, you know. And most of the stations were top 40 stations. They were white stations. But you gotta remember, and I was told this firsthand by guys that I used to listen to and that I ultimately began to work with when I went to WCBS FM, the guys that worked on WMCA, the good guys and the All Americans on WABC. And the late Dan Ingram told me they listened to WWRL when we had our new survey come out, and that they would then the survey, and the following week, many of the records that were in our top 16 wound up on the WABC playlist because they knew and understood that we had a large white listenership.
Hmm.
So if the white kids were listening to WWRL, listening to these songs and loved these songs, they had to play those songs.
Hmm.
So black radio, something that was very, very, it was positive. Most of us knew we had an obligation to our communities, and we didn't walk around with our pants below our butts. we, we tried to be dressed,
Yeah,
and
indeed,
some of the
indeed.
guys like Eddie OJ had nice, fancy cars, and because we were being emulated, the people. So we had to have a very positive image.
I remember that Frankie Crocker said once that he saw Eddie O.J. somewhere, and that Eddie O.J. had a sports car, and that
That was in, that was in
in,
Buffalo.
in Buffalo, and
In Buffalo,
he didn't know, he had never seen a car like that, and he said,
yeah.
"What does that guy do?" He said, "I want to be like that guy," and that guy uh, became uh, Eddie OJ. Indeed, Eddie OJ. But some of the people that you worked with, particularly during the 70s with Hank Spann and Bobby J and uh, you know, Bledsoe and can
Cherry Bledsoe,
talk a little
Gary
bit about
Himotep,
yeah Imhotep, Gary.
Himotep, Gary Bird.
Yeah, radio. Let's talk a little bit, if you can. What's it like to be one of the soul brothers, at
Yes,
WWRL, the great entertainer?
yes, and you called us the Temptations of radio.
That's right.
Well, I'm still taken aback by the fact that we were all different. We all had different personalities. We brought something different to the table,
Hmm.
and apparently the audiences loved what we did. You know, Gary Bird was on the vanguard of rap. You know, he picked up a lot of things that Curtis Mayfield wrote. If you had a choice of colors and things, I thought
Hmm.
Gary wrote it. I didn't know that. Curtis Mayfield wrote the song, and I was a singer. I brought that the so-called doo wop thing to the table because most of the acts at the time I knew them because I had worked with them. I'd done shows with them, and you had Jeffrey Troy who worked in Pittsburgh, and he brought his thing. He was the devilish angel. And Hank Spann was the original rapper in New York City. All the rappers listen to Hank Spann every night. You know, put your foot on the rock, pat it, and don't you dare stop.
Yes.
Things like that, funkier than a mosquito sweeter.
Yeah.
So you know, we all brought different things to the table. Enoch Hawthorne Gregory, the Dixie Drifter, one of the greatest morning men ever.
Hmm.
And it was just a fantastic thing. And when you put a bunch of guys together, the Soul Brothers, and play the Apollo Theater like every 6 weeks, and most people came not only to see the acts, but they came to see us too because we were as big as any act that we presented.
Absolutely, absolutely. You could go. You can have a show. Whoever the performers. I don't try and not name anybody, belittle anybody, but you could
Mhm.
put them on the marquee, and then at the head of the marquee, at the top of the marquee would be the disc jockey. It
Right.
would whatever the singers were, but the headliner would be Enoch Gregory, or
Yeah, and even the guy who preceded all of us, Tommy Smalls, Doctor
yeah,
Jive.
yeah,
Doctor Jive was as big in New York as Alan Freed was.
yeah,
They
yeah,
competed with each other.
yeah. Now that was somebody else did that. It didn't Red Sullivan, not Red Sullivan. What's the guy's name? Ed Sullivan. He did that as well, where he screwed up the name of the disc jockey, and 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 who was the he didn't know what this kind of music is. This is rhythm
They
and
call it
good, rhythm and
rhythm and rock, rhythm and color,
yeah,
rhythm. Because he had Tommy Smalls, and he had Tommy Smalls on his show. Brought
yeah,
Bo Diddley
yeah,
on the show.
yeah. Yeah, the disc jockey was the major factor in music radio, and in for instance, the OJs are named after the OJ. Right? What was that story?
Well, they were known as the mascots, and at the time, Eddie was working in, I think, in the Cleveland area, and he was having a show, and they wanted to be on the show, and he put them on the show, but he told them he didn't like the name mascots. He said it didn't suit them. So they said, "Well, what can we call ourselves?" And Eddie told me Walter Williams said, "Well, why don't we call ourselves the OJs?" And he said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, it sounds good." And he managed them for like 6 or 7 years in
Hmm.
the early days. They were the OJs. His name will live forever.
Hmm. And they are still the OJs.
They're still the OJ.
It's the OJs, And indeed, those days, again, we kind of go back and forth a little bit with, but the people that we were living that time, young people who were on the street corner. What was that feeling? What was that like living singing rather on the street corners? It was kind of a what do we say? That was kind of a uh, symphony, and I think
Hmm.
there was a book I think talking about the street corner symphonies, but
Yeah.
that's what was happening throughout our communities, and the people who lived on the street lived in the hung out on the street corner were celebrities at home in our own neighborhood.
Mhm.
Was to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
somebody, you know. Just go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, we sang on street corners because we needed a place to rehearse. You couldn't really do it in your house,
Right.
and primarily we did it because we were attracting girls. Most of us got into the business not looking to make a lot of money. We're looking to attract girls.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could sing good, the girls would flock. And that was the primary motivation of
Mm-hmm.
doing it.
Not even
And
a
of course,
record deal.
no, 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 no. Um, the first, I'm from Harlem, and the first group from our neighborhood to get a record deal that I recall just lost their lead singer fairly recently, Tony Middleton, the Willows. They were from 115th Street, and they got a recording contract. I said,
Mm-hmm.
man, hey man, the Willows, man, they made a record. It just it motivated us, and of course, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, when they came out, that's when I decided because I had started singing like a year before they hit. I started singing in 1955, and they hit in '56. But the Teenagers, they were the first super group with
Period.
hit
In
records
the
that
music
traveled the world.
industry.
And that's when I decided that's what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to be in this business, you know, and hopefully one day maybe I can make a couple of dollars, you
Mhm,
know.
mhm.
But as
The,
I, as I, as I, as I've said it many, many times, the industry was pulled by grown-ups, by adults. The
mhm,
talent populated by kids.
mhm.
And we kids knew nothing about the business.
Neither did their families.
Families knew nothing about the business. There was no such thing then as entertainment lawyer. It didn't exist.
Right.
The family had a lawyer. He was a probate lawyer. He was a real estate lawyer. Knew nothing about the business and the contracts.
Mhm,
I was accused of having a very big mouth back in those days because all of our contracts were for 90%. You get 3%. If you were the Supremes, maybe you got 5%. Sometimes you got a penny and a half. And then I wondered, how did they split the penny?
mhm,
But it was 90%. So I would say, well, wait a minute, wait a minute. What do you mean 90%? Where does the first 10% go? you know, they took 10% right off the top.
mm, mm. The you just mentioned somebody else. I've heard we had the same conversation as well with Lloyd Price, as the record people were taking all the money, and
Yes,
uh, and we had no idea. And like Lloyd says, what do we know about a contract? What do we know
that's
about
right.
who should or what is a work hire? So we had no idea what they're talking about. But
Had
go
no
ahead.
idea. Had absolutely no idea. And the sad thing was, most of the songs that came out in that era were written by the groups themselves.
Yeah.
But somehow the owner of the record company's name was on the record as the writer.
Mm, mm-hmm,
George Goldner at G Records, his name is next to Frankie Lyman and Herman Santiago.
mm-hmm,
First pressing, they had the three names. Second pressing, Herman Santiago's name was gone.
mm,
George Goldner never wrote a song in his life.
mm-hmm. Never.
And then when he sold out to Morris Levy, Golden's name was replaced by Levy. So
I was looking.
you look at records like "Why the Fools Fall in Love," you'll see Lyman and Levy. Morris
Hmm.
Levy didn't write that song, and we we knew nothing about a thing called publishing.
Hmm.
Publishing is the real estate of the record industry. We didn't know anything about that.
That's right. I was I was looking at a book a minute ago about chess records, and
Yes.
chess did they did a lot exploiting of the performers.
Hmm.
Yeah, there was, and you mentioned uh, Morris Levy. Yeah, that was something. We're about to run out of time. Still, so much more that we could talk about how the music was being exploited by. I think you point out, which is important to point out, is that this music was being exploited by adults, the kids who
Yes.
were producing it and performing it and living it and writing the songs and writing the stories, the storyline, the narrative that came from kids.
Yeah.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
And also keep in mind the people who were running the record companies at that time, the adults, they were only in their 30s and maybe early 40s. They weren't old people,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, it was the early days. They were learning. All right,
Yeah.
Jay. Thank you spending some time with me for my Bob Law Now podcast. Good to have a conversation with you. There's more. There's more.
Yeah.
We probably have to do it again, and because we could talk just about doo wop, and then
Yes.
we could talk only about music radio, particularly the stories about radio and how significant radio has been in our lives. And so again, thank you so much for spending this time with me.
I enjoyed it, Bob. It's my pleasure. Absolutely.
All right.